We're going to wrap up our discussion of Freud's dream theory today, paying particular attention to those elements of the dream work that we haven't said an awful lot about so far. Those two elements of the dream work are displacement and representability. Actually, we have said something about those, but I want to just expand upon them. By way of introduction, let's state a kind of objective of this approach to thinking about dreams in the first place. And that is to say that if we're to be analysts or students of the unconscious, we need to be able to familiar ourselves with those mechanisms, those dream work mechanisms through which the unconscious is conveyed and represented. As I've stated here, we need to be able to read the primary process. We need to be familiar with those operations so that we're able to hear the possibility of certain unconscious significations that are being expressed. So just as a kind of humorous way of beginning, I wanted to emphasize a couple of little rebus images, just because we had noted in our previous lectures the importance of the conditions of representability or dramatization. Freud's idea that the images, the visual experience of dreams often stems from a verbal formula, a must keep time, words, thoughts that need to be conveyed in images. And that's partly what the dream work does. And when the dream work finds images, visual experiences to stand in for the words, it's doing something symbolic. It's doing a symbolic operation. It's finding an image to stand in for a word. But it's also doing so in a way, at least for Freud, that disguises some of the contents of what actually what is being motivated for in the unconscious part of the mind. So here we have a little rebus. Here's another rebus image. I mean, that is a rebus of a rebus, because I'm being witty. This is Timmy, and if you're trying to figure out what this rebus is, it helps if you're British, because you might get it. That's a picture of Timmy high on E. In America, I suppose we'd have to put Timmy high on X, but anyways, that's Timmy on ecstasy. And it made me think of something I read in the Guardian newspaper years ago. A book reviewer was talking about a certain book, and presumably it was a book on Freudian psychoanalysis, and the reviewer said, one of the bylines of Freudian psychoanalysis is always watch out for the pun, or I suppose we could say listen out for the pun. And I think that's a crucial idea, not just in how we attend to the speech of people that come to the clinic and to one another, not just looking for the Freudian slip, I suppose that too, but constantly be aware of visual puns. That's what I'm trying to convey with the idea of the rebus. So we've said a little bit more about representability. We want to keep that in play. I'll just give one brief further example before we move on to the topic of displacement. Some years ago I had a dream, and my wife isn't an analyst, but she should be, because she came up with a very nice conditions of representability interpretation. I said, oh, I had this dream about a previous girlfriend, and like she was kind of around the dream, and I had to move a whole lot of her suitcases and a whole lot of her belongings, which were in this hotel room, and I just couldn't get all of them into the damn room. And so my wife said, without skipping a beat, she had a lot of baggage. Very nice interpretation, using the pun, using the visual pun to try and get to a kind of unintended meaning that you could say that the unconscious was trying to express. Right, so that's another nice example, and we reiterated before that the unconscious often does precisely that. It uses a bad pun. It sounds like a bad joke. Let's turn now to displacement. I've left displacement right to the very end because it seems that you can find at least 3 different ways of understanding how displacement works as a disguise mechanism and as a primary process element of the dream work for Freud. There's at least 3 of them, and I've subtitled this lecture Sticky Substitutions and Rerouted Affects, precisely to play up 2 of those meanings of displacement. The first possible understanding of displacement, and we've already suggested this, is that when there is a certain affect in a dream, and we use the example of obsessive compulsive disorder, we could think of other examples as well of affect in everyday life. When someone is experiencing an affect, we could always ask psychoanalytically, where else might that affect apply? Where else might that affect refer to? Or what else might that affect refer to? So if we're going to grasp how displacement operates, I've given us these 3 questions. if someone has a dream, the dream is frightening, the dream is wonderful, we could ask, what else does that affective experience refer to? Now, without getting into all the technicalities of Freud and later Lacanian psychoanalytic readings and understandings of affect, we could throw out the postulate that for Freud, sometimes Freud seems to have slightly different views on this, but for the most part, Freud wants to insist that affects themselves aren't unconscious, which kind of makes sense. It doesn't really make an awful lot of sense to say that I'm dealing with a repressed unconscious emotion, because the very nature of emotional affect seems to be that it is embodied, affectively realized. Now, of course, there's lots of debates about that, but let's just take that lead for the time being. If the affect itself, like anxiety, would be the primary case, if anxiety itself is not repressed but is felt, the best way of defending against it, presumably, is to link that anxiety to something other than what might be really the debilitating source of someone's anxiety. So if we can, as it were, domesticate that anxiety by linking it to a behavior, hand washing, turning the heater on and off, or off and then on again and then off, those kinds of behaviors, they might represent a little nucleus of anxiety. They might get the person very agitated, but they are a domestication. They are locating that anxiety in a certain place. That's a little tangent, little footnote. Back to the question of dreams though, whenever there is an affect in the dream, we could ask, has that affect been rerouted? Has it got another origin or another location? And does it actually refer to another idea which it has been severed from or rerouted from? That would be one way of thinking of displacement. Displacement here is the displacement of affect from one idea to another. So keep that one in mind. A second, and I love this, sometimes Freud wants to say that displacement isn't just one feature within a dream, but is a really important element of dreams per se, because if you do the phenomenology of dreaming, you could say that dreams are often decentered, misplaced, upside down, strange. It's hard to get a sense of how everything fits together, which incidentally is also why Freud says you can add a fifth element here. Not only are we dealing with condensation, symbolism, displacement, and representability, he goes on later to say, what about secondary elaboration, the process that happens when you tell your dream? So to put a dream into words, to give it a kind of narrative sensibility is again to distort the actual experience of the dream. It's to give it more cohesion, more of a storyline than it originally had. And Freud would argue that's another way actually of distorting, of disguising the material. But back to the question of displacement as it occurs within the contents of the dream. Very simple way of trying to make the point. What seems focal in the dream, what seems important in the dream, and what seems peripheral, what seems trivial, unimportant. One of Freud's key tips for the interpretation of the dream is to listen carefully, but what the dreamer is foregrounding as focal, as the most important, as central. It's often far more productive to ask them to associate to the trivial, unimportant details of the dream. And Freud's idea here is that one of the ways that the dream works is by taking what's really important of the unconscious latent content and making that a trivial feature, and what's very trivial or unimportant in the unconscious latent thoughts, making that foregrounded, central. So there's a nice kind of reversal, and Freud here indulges in a bit of a Nietzschean turn of phrase, and he says that what we see through distortion in dreams is a transvaluation of all psychical values. Sounds a bit complicated, but you could say one of the dream work's principal mechanisms of disguise is precisely to take what was important, making it trivial, and what was less important, foregrounding that. It's a way of jumbling up the dream and doing distortion, but yes, indeed, displacement of an importance, you could say, or displacement to the whole structural integrity of the dream as such. Now, the third element of displacement that I wanted to mention, and we've got rerouted affects up here, now we're thinking about sticky substitutes. We could say that displacement also operates at the level of symbolic substitutions. Now you may say, but Derek, you already told me about symbolic substitutions. You said condensation, symbolism, displacement, conditions of representability. And you would be right. And I think what we'll start to find when we turn back to Philip Roth is that in practice within the dream, those four elements of the dream work aren't always completely separate. Conceptually, it helps to get a good sense of what's the difference between them and how they may operate, but they're not always absolutely discrete. And I think the same applies here. You could say the displacement of symbolic substitutes overlaps pretty much with the whole idea of symbolization. That's okay. Thinking them, even if we think about both of those ideas as leading us to similar phenomena in the dream, is all right, in as much as it encourages us to do this kind of thinking. So if we want to understand displacement as it happens at the level of substitutions, I think it helps to think about sticky substitutions, to think about contiguity, to think about closeness, to think about how in a given dream, a person, a place, a thing might in fact be a substitute, a stand-in for something close to a thing, a person, a place that the unconscious is actually concerned with. Hence the idea of a sticky substitution. And hence my third question. Are certain people, places, objects, and substitutions in a dream actually people, places, or objects that are close to them? So when we're thinking about the contents of the dream, are they substitutions for something close to what is actually their unconscious preoccupation or question? Now, two words that help me get that idea of displacement. One is the idea of an extension. So if in the dream of the scene, the film scene we mentioned before, a couple is going to consummate their relationship, you can't show it, but what you do show is the scene the next day with stockings, a belt, shoes, so on and so forth, socks on the floor. You've got that, as it were, sticky substitution. You've got that extension. Something close to what cannot be shown is shown. A very kind of basic example of this came once when I was doing some prison work in Wandsworth Prison, and one of the things that comes up a lot there is people have a whole series of alibis and excuses for why they didn't do something that they've been charged with. And the sexual offender that I was working with kept on saying, no, it wasn't me. No, I didn't do it. It was my cousin. Which seemed to me an odd moment because, I mean, maybe that was the truth for all I know, but it seems almost as if there's a kind of displacement logic there. No, it wasn't me. It was someone close to me. A bit like a silly anecdote. You go to the pharmacy when you're a 14-year-old kid, and this obviously didn't happen to me. You go to the pharmacy when you're a 14-year-old kid, you say, I want some condoms. No, not for me, they're for my friend. In other words, some kind of substitution, not for me, but someone close to me. So I think keeping that idea of an extension or a kind of transfer, a sticky substitution, helps in understanding something of displacement. And the one further example that came to me here was this notion, I don't even know if it's true, but in popular culture, sometimes you have the figure of a voodoo doll. The voodoo doll works its magic both because it resembles someone and because it actually has something taken from their person. And I think that element of contiguity, that closeness, you actually need something that was close to their person, that was in fact part of them in a way, helps us grasp something of how displacement works. So there we have 3 lines of analysis, 3 questions one can ask to almost any element of dream content. And I think they're pretty fertile ways of trying to open up the content. So by way of conclusion, I just want us to return briefly to Philip Roth's dream. The overarching agenda of these lectures has been not only to try to introduce, explore, explain, and find synonyms, conceptual synonyms for the main 4 elements of the dream work, we also wanted to ground them in some examples. So I'm just going to pull out a couple of lines. You've heard them before, but here they go. In the dream, says Philip Roth, talking about the dream, ostensibly of his father, there's an old American warship, stripped of its armaments, wholly disabled. I was expecting my father to be on the ship, somewhere amongst the crew. The dead silent picture, a portrait of the aftermath of a disaster, cleared by some recent catastrophe of all living things. The mood was heartbreaking in exactly the way it had been when President Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Ultimately, I understood it wasn't that my father was aboard the ship, but that my father was the ship. An enfeebled wreck. Now, I've given you maybe 20, 30 words a whole bunch of phrases from the dream. They seem to me so wonderfully and so aptly to describe some of what we've looked at. Speaking about the old American warship, it sounds like that is a symbol. That's a symbolization for his father. He even says something like a battle gray old American warship. Now, in that moment, it sounds like the warship symbolizes his father, okay? Remember earlier I said that those four elements of the dream work, they sometimes seem to overlap. So the ship seems on one hand to symbolize his father. Later on, he even goes on to say, well, then I realized it wasn't that my father was aboard the ship, but that my father was the ship. And in that little distinction, I think we have a distinction between a form of displacement and symbolism. If the father was aboard the ship, then the ship would have been by displacement a substitution for the father, you could argue, because the father was aboard the ship. The ship was close to the father. So like the Port Newark, where he was taken to by his father and his uncle, the ship could have been via displacement, via a sticky substitution, a stand-in for his father. And I think that is in some instances the case. If that's the case, you could argue that the ship is at least three things. It's the displacement of his father, okay, the one operation of the dream work. It's a symbolization of his father. That's a second element of the dream work. But it is also via the conditions of representability, the enfeebled wreck, wholly disabled. Remember, look for the words, how an image is standing in for words. Look for the pun, the visual pun. So my point there is that those three operations of the dream work all seem to be exemplified in how he speaks about the words he uses to speak about the warship. Let's just also note the dead silent picture, a portrait of the aftermath of a disaster, cleared by some catastrophe of all living things. I'd already mentioned that, and I asked, when Derek is talking about a sick dog, Grey's Anatomy, Derek, what is he actually talking about? And we could ask the same with those lines. Now, many of you may not know an awful lot about Philip Roth, but Philip Roth is a Jewish-American author, and in the course of Patrimony, he goes to Israel and he meets a Holocaust survivor, and there's a whole long narrative about that. Now, it's kind of giving a lot away, but presumably, one could argue, when those lines come up, the dead silent picture, portrait of an aftermath of a disaster, cleared by some catastrophe of all living things, one could ask, what is Philip Roth speaking about? A scene of the death of his father, a scene of Roosevelt's death, a scene of demise, a scene of extinction. Could it be that his words, as he's speaking there, refer to something else? We don't know. We wouldn't be able to know. If we were the analyst of Philip Roth, we would maybe just repeat those words and see if it opened up another trajectory of meaning that perhaps he was aware of, or perhaps that he wasn't aware of. Interestingly also, we spoke about displacement, and that displacement can be operative within affects. So you could ask, is this dream, how does he put it, heartbreaking mood, did it apply to the death of his father? Presumably. It seemed to also apply to Roosevelt's death. We could also ask, what else does it apply to? There's a lot here about the theme of childhood. Maybe there's a sense that this heartbreaking scene will also apply to him one day. In other words, how can we use the notion of displacement as an analytical category? So that's, I think, as best we can do to try and explain the main subcomponents within displacement and to try and illustrate something of the conditions of representability. Let's just sign off then with one last observation. And that is that we've spent a lot of time thinking about those four component aspects of the dream work, which, as it were, rework, find different symbolic outlets and means of expression for latent content that cannot simply be expressed. They find disguised forms for those. And in doing that, just like we saw in the work of 50 Shades of Grey, the imagined 50 Shades of Grey exercise that I gave you, there's a lot of symbolic work. There's a lot of symbolic operations that transform some potential contents into different types of contents. In the case of the dream, different visual experiences. Now, if that's true, what should we do clinically with dreams? We often have the idea that, well, free association is something Freud talks about. So if we're interested in psychoanalysis, you just do free association. But I think now we start to get a sense of why free association is kind of going in exactly the opposite way. It's than dream work. It's trying to undo the dream work. It's trying to open up a whole series of other associations and links to what is being experienced, what's being spoken of, links that may surprise the dreamer themselves. So last point, take-home point. One crucial error in many attempts at dream interpretation, we almost always do this, even if we think we're being somehow loyal to Freudian psychoanalysis. You have your little scenario of a dream, the story of the dream. You tell someone the story and then you keep that story intact and you say, well, the lawnmower in the dream meant this. The foot of the guy that I mowed over in my dream, well, that was so-and-so's foot. And the sun that was shining there represented that. Freud says that's hopeless. That's hopeless. Remember the whole point about secondary elaboration, that how you storyfy the dream does damage to it. It adds another level of distortion and disguise. So for Freud, and this is crucial, maybe basic, but crucial, when someone speaks about a dream, it's almost as if the analyst should be writing down or as many of the key signifiers as they can, or maybe some of the trivial signifiers as they can, and asking the person to associate to each of them, to absolutely deconstruct the dream so that the story coherence of the dream no longer applies. And to take each element, the lawnmower, the foot, the sun, and get a whole array of associations to each of those things to unpack them. In other words, there will be no successful dream interpretation unless one free associates, breaks apart that storyline, and creates an associative set of signifiers apart from the ones that are presented in the story of the dream.